Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now on our 34th episode of 2025. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco and Gaia, the platinum sponsors of Five for Breakfast. We had a standing room only turnout yesterday in Toronto for our regional Fiber Connect workshop. Earlier this year, we had kicked off a Canadian working group to focus on Canadian-specific deployment issues, best practices, and Canadian public policy. And that group is growing like crazy. I didn't realize how much the Canadian market was in need of a unifying industry effort to advance broadband in the Great White North. And while 90% of Canada lives within 100 kilometers of the U.S. border, the other 10% is so much more rural and geographically dispersed with much lower density than the U.S. So it's exciting to hear from our rural Canadian operators who are deploying 25 gig PON to First Nations in rural northern Canada. NTI's BEAD final proposals are starting to trickle out for public comment. Last week, we saw Louisiana and Virginia's final proposals with about 80% fiber. And congratulations to Kelly Workman, the director of the West Virginia State Broadband Office, who stuck to her guns despite incredible political pressure from Washington. She delivered a plan with 94% fiber locations. Previously, she had delivered a final proposal with 100% fiber locations, coming in $200 million below budget, but Washington sent her home with a mandate to make more room for LEO satellites. If any state is desperate for fiber, jobs, and economic development, it's West Virginia. So we applaud Kelly's grit and determination in the fight for rural West Virginia families. Yesterday, the FCC's notice proposed rulemaking on modernizing the Commission's NEPA rules was published in the Federal Register, triggering a 30-day comment period. The FCC seeks comment on how the Commission should revise its rules to streamline the environmental review process and promote efficiency and certainty for the Commission applicants to encourage deployment of infrastructure. So comments are due on September 18th, and replies are due on October 3rd. With our wildly successful regional Fiber Connect workshop in Toronto now behind us, we look forward to our next regional event in Spokane, Washington on September 16th. Then we'll be in Scottsdale on October 16th, Kansas City on November 11th, and then we'll end the year at a premier member meeting on December 8th and 9th in Palm Springs. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Ed Barrett, the president of Broadband for HR Green, to discuss grading America's broadband funding, the findings of the 2025 report card for America's infrastructure. Before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We appreciate it. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsors of Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco and Gaia. Now, as participants, you are in listen-only mode. To ask a question, please type it into the question box, which is located within the control panel under our video screen. We will host a Q&A session with our panelists after the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to respond. We appreciate your input. And with that, I will pass things back over to Gary to get us started. Gary?
Thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest was Bill Baker, the CEO and owner of NextLink, to discuss fiber and fixed wireless, a winning combination for NextLink. We had a great conversation with Bill, and he discussed NextLink's unique business model and how the new revised rules for BEAD have changed the way that they're looking at BEAD and the way they're applying for funds. If you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Ed Barrett, the president of Broadband for HR Green, to discuss grading America's broadband, the findings of the 2025 report card for America's infrastructure. Ed has more than 15 years of telecom experience working with carriers and local communities nationwide. He currently serves as the president of HR Green's Broadband Business Unit. In this role, Ed works with clients across the U.S. ranging from the smallest of small towns to million-plus urban regions who are studying and implementing broadband solutions as a way to enhance the lives of their constituents and grow into gigabit economy. This includes engaging with clients throughout the entire project lifecycle, from planning to visioning to design, construction, and deployment. Ed is a sought-after subject matter presenter on broadband and fiber topics at national and regional conferences. So welcome, Ed. For our audience, please type in your questions, and we'll work those into discussion at the end. With that, I will turn things over to Ed.
Thanks, Gary. That intro was really a mouthful. I'll have my marketing folks work on condensing that down a little bit. Sorry about that. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about the nation's infrastructure. Obviously, all of us in kind of the broadband space understand this issue impacts every American. It's crucial to our economy. Today I'll be sharing broadly the findings of the 2025 report card. It's the nation's oldest engineering society. ASCE represents 160,000 civil engineers who really, share a goal of stewarding the nation's infrastructure. ASCE since 1988 has been publishing a report card on that infrastructure. Provides an assessment of conditions and needs. It evaluates 18 categories based on 8 key criteria, and I'll walk you through this year. This year for ASCE, broadband was a new chapter. I was lucky enough to be invited to help as an advisor with my background in broadband, talking to a bunch of civil engineers who I'm not one of, but I respect the heck out of the work that civil engineers do across the country. So this was an interesting expansion of the report card, I think, for the organization, and in some ways kind of a challenging one. So if you look at kind of what we do to help classify each of the grades, the committee makes recommendations, based on the prior report, which every 4 years this report is published, and we make recommendations to either raise or lower the grades for the nation's infrastructure broadly in aggregate, but also within 18 specific categories. And those grades really are, A to F to overly simplify things, from exceptional to failing and critical, where you have infrastructure that literally is on the point of failure and, creates public hazards. So the report card is prepared by the Committee on America's Infrastructure. It's 52 civil engineers, infrastructure professionals from around the country with lots of experience specifically within each of the categories. ASCE staff, the committee evaluates relevant data, reports from government agencies, private sector, nonprofits, other organizations, essentially solicits both data and feedback from industry experts to really gain, hopefully, a wide view of the nation's infrastructure. They then examine each category in the context of capacity, its condition, the funding, future needs, O&M, public safety, resilience, and innovation. So, basically looking at how equipped is that infrastructure both for today, where's the funding gap, and how equipped is it for the future. So breaking down the grades at a macro scale, for the first time ever, America's cumulative GPA was a C. That's the highest that it's ever been rated by ASCE. And for the first time since 1998, no category received a D- or lower grade. Since ASCE's last report 4 years ago, the new grades demonstrate really that investment in infrastructure does make a difference. Landmark federal infrastructure legislation initiated thousands of critical, necessary projects around the country. And, IJA was, the largest comprehensive infrastructure package in U.S. history, obviously. $1.2 trillion in infrastructure investments over 5 years. $550 billion of that was funding that was allocated to brand new programs. And, the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 also marked the largest climate investment in U.S. history. So, those investments in resilient infrastructure, they've proven to be an effective use of limited public dollars. There's always choices because those investments reduce cost in the long term. They minimize rebuilding needs after a significant event. By adopting up-to-date codes and standards, communities are better equipped to handle resiliency-related disasters and, most responsibly deploy those public resources. Having said that, despite those positive trends, 9 categories are still in the D range. So they include infrastructure that Americans use every day, roads, transit, and energy. Broadband, as I mentioned, was a first-time graded category in the 2025 report. The Committee for America's Infrastructure determined, much like those of us that are in the industry have known for a long time, really, broadband is too integral to the daily lives of Americans and even for other infrastructure networks to function for us not to really dig in and provide a more thorough assessment of the sector. Fast and reliable connection obviously is essential. Reliable broadband access really is mandatory for businesses and communities to thrive. The cost of, the estimated $56 billion to deploy current broadband speeds for every American by 2030. Federal investments are estimated to total $65 billion over the same time period. There is a lot of need out there, and a lot of funding, as you talked about, Gary. Despite the reset that's kind of thrown everybody over the last 3 months into a bit of a frenzy of work and effort, the money is out there, and the final broadband grade was a C+. Interestingly enough, and maybe just to provide a little bit of flavor on that grade, probably one of the biggest things, and might be a good time to pull up the poll that we had waiting before the show at some point here. But really, it was very, very hard to create a national grade, because if you look at it, there are states where some state broadband directors would literally say, we're probably a D-. We have a lot of vast, rural land in our state. It's very underserved. It's woefully underserved. And you have some places that are, more urban. They have a lot of fiber. They have a lot of high-speed broadband that exists in those areas. And, you may have some B+ or, B+ out there, maybe some A-. So this aggregate grade was probably, we think a good rating for a first-time category. One of the challenges that we had in creating the grade really was the fact that, in a lot of places that, civil engineering touches, there's very good data. Bridge conditions are, bridges are inspected every so often. Those records are kept at a state and a national level. But you look at broadband's infrastructure, because it's so heavily private, there's no source of what do America's poles look like, right? You just don't have access to that kind of information. So a challenge, no doubt, but one that we felt comfortable providing an aggregate at a C+ initial rating. Just a couple more notes about ASCE's methodology. We encourage or urge sustained investment that does prioritize resiliency to raise the national infrastructure grade over the next 4 years. Advancing policy and embracing innovation are really critical to ensuring the nation's infrastructure is improved and it stays strong. That investment is ultimately an investment in jobs, people, and the economy. We have as an organization 3 overarching solutions, but please, we encourage you to visit the website to see specific suggestions under each solution. Smart investment will only be possible by sustained investment, prioritizing resiliency and advancing policy. That infrastructure investment has to consistently and wisely be allocated, starting with, as a baseline, maintaining existing levels, then working together with state and local governments and the private sector to close the remaining gaps. Resilience is, as we mentioned, pretty critical for the built environment. Across the U.S., disasters of greater intensity, duration, and frequency have wreaked havoc on communities every day and, in every location. In 2024, for example, a total of 27 extreme weather events caused 568 deaths and over $182 billion in damages, including critical infrastructure that was destroyed. We have to do more to integrate resilience to protect against the impacts of those extreme weather events. And lastly, we have to adopt forward-thinking policies and innovations. Infrastructure improvements do rely on both the private and public sectors to address needs and advance solutions. We have to find ways to encourage cooperation across all levels of government, and the private sector for a successfully integrated infrastructure network. We welcome you. ASC welcomes you to check out if you're interested in learning more about the various infrastructure categories. The full report is available on infrastructurereportcard.org. It's fascinating information. I know this, the FBA obviously is very focused on the nation's fiber and broadband slice of this, but there is a ton of very good and interesting information. Obviously, fiber reaches out and touches into a number of these other infrastructure categories as well. And it looks like David has added that link to the resource for attendees. So if you're interested, we encourage you to visit the website.
Well, Ed, this is super interesting. First of all, David, go to the scorecard chart for all the infrastructure. I think it's that orange one. It's shocking that with how much we spent $1 trillion on the infrastructure after COVID. This is not a good report card on our overall nation's critical infrastructure. When a C+ is better than average, that's pretty bad.
Gary? Interestingly enough, this was a significant improvement in the nation's infrastructure. I think there's not a great understanding of the condition of some of the infrastructure that's in place. You hear the headline stories. You hear about Flint, Michigan's water system, for instance, and that grabs the headline. But those types of issues, maybe not lead pipe issues like they have in Flint, but those types of issues exist across the country. Infrastructure that's been put in place 30 years ago is beginning to age out. It's reaching the end of its useful life. But it was my first time on the committee. But in general, despite the C grade, there was a sense that the nation is getting it and is investing, and a real sense of optimism that if we could maintain that there's some opportunity for these grades to continue to go up.
So, Ed, what's the rubric for grading broadband? Is it looking at the penetration of fiber, or what are the things that you guys look at?
Yeah, Gary, it was a little more challenging for this working group than maybe the Bridges group, and I'm sure they had their own challenges, but the lack of hard data around infrastructure condition, I think in broadband, the fact that the poles are owned by the electric utilities, most of the assets that are out there are privately owned. They're viewed as competitive data sets. People don't want to share infrastructure information, condition. All of that made a pole by pole kind of what's the condition really, really challenging. So we looked at access as one of the key drivers, right? We in our industry all know that the maps aren't perfect, but have the maps gotten significantly better in the last 5 years? I think we'd all agree with that. It's as you really zoom down at the micro, the macro is probably pretty decent at the micro level, that's where the fights begin. Absolutely, access was one of the keys. But again, we really looked using the rubric that I brought up before. This is the methodology. What are the conditions? What's the capacity? How are we doing on O&M and public safety and resilience and future need? So funding stream was absolutely a part of this. There's a feeling that yes, there are big gaps out there, but there's also a very large kind of generational funding that is coming. Of course, this report was completed just as the new administration sort of pump the brakes on it and reset. So this is not an ASCE comment, but I'll say personally, as a member of the industry, I'm glad to see some of the programs rolling out with a good emphasis on fiber. I think there were concerns that it was going to become more of an LEO show, but we did not want to make technology judgments from an ASCE perspective. We agreed that there's space for a lot of technologies in the solution, and that the solution is the important thing.
Yeah, so it's one of the things you might want to consider. Are you going to be doing this then going forward, or are you one and done on this?
I think I'll probably be here for another round.
Yeah, because some of the comments are coming in when you're looking at, broadband might be, and you can take the charts down, David, but broadband might be too narrow a term. When we're building out critical infrastructure, comments like, what about 5G and, our wireless infrastructure? And so all that's fiber. But even just coming from Canada, when we were in Calgary last year, the head of economic development, everybody was talking about AI hyperscalers and bringing all these hyperscalers to Ontario because they had lots of power, lots of water, and a cool climate. So it's just perfect environment for AI hyperscalers. But in Toronto, there are 0 data centers or hyperscalers AI center because they don't have the power infrastructure, but also the fiber infrastructure. So when we think about our nation's AI infrastructure, we need to get fiber out as much as possible to create big miss was the fact in Louisiana that Northeast Louisiana's parishes that were fiber in the original round, and they got more to LEO, which really sucks for Northeast Louisiana, but it also sucks for the opportunity for AI data centers, which, given that fiber infrastructure. So, I would suggest that you look at overall all the things that fiber is enabling, like, the whole mobile wireless and 5G and 6G and all that stuff that's part of BEAD, supposed to be part of the priority broadband project. And then the other part is it gets kind of I'm not sure how you do this, right? Because if you look at the FCC maps or any maps, everything LEO, put a satellite in the sky, it covers everything. But now, according to the BEAD rules, if you give LEO operators money, now it's served. So does that mean it falls off the map as unserved? I'm not sure if it's still unserved or if it's served. Nothing changed other than money. So how does that go to our infrastructure? Are you guys,
Gary, I think we're all on the edge of our seats waiting to see how that's going to play out, right? Like, I agree. We did. I kind of watching the Q&A, and there was some look at 5G cellular. I think obviously data center, AI economy, all of those things are certainly driven by connectivity, right? And I think there was an awareness of that, and having said that, in this round there was certainly a focus on broadband as a utility, infrastructure condition as opposed to business model or technology, preferencing, and I think that was very intentional by ASCE. So, but there are a whole number of kind of inputs that I think are valuable to look at for ASCE going forward. I appreciate that.
Yeah, just personally, I just got Live Oak Fiber last week, so 5 gig symmetric, 5 gig symmetric, and before I had cable, which was I was paying for 2 gig. They would never tell me the upstream, and I never really got 2 gig, and it all depended on who was on the network, what I actually got. So it was pretty sketchy. So everything's changed. I mean, my reliability, the fact I don't have to kick people off, tell a family members not get on the internet when I have a telehealth session or doing fiber breakfast or anything like that. The other part is, as now that I have 5 gig to my house, my Wi-Fi 6E mesh network can't support 5 gig. So luckily, my good friends at Lightera gave me a fiber to the room setup. So I'm going to be installing that to get get fiber right to my laptop and be able to. So I think, we'll see more of that as people, because in Canada, we saw even as I mentioned in the beginning, those operators going to the Northwest, or excuse me, the North, Canadians North, to First Nations and rural areas are deploying 25 gig PON. I think there's 19 deployments in the U.S. of 25 gig PON. 50 gig is coming within the next 2 years. Now people are talking about 200 gig PON. So, the infrastructure, once we get fiber everywhere, and our members are doing a fantastic job of using private capital to get fiber everywhere. So I'm feeling pretty good that, we are going to hit another record. We are over 12 million homes passed per year. We're over 50% fiber. And by the end of the decade, with private investment, we're going to get largely everywhere covered. So I'm feeling pretty good. All right. So tell me about what's next. So who looks at this report and what are they going to do with this?
Yeah, Gary, I think that, the target audience for this report really is, this is largely a desire to help shape the discussion around policy. It's federal, state, local policymakers. And unfortunately, in some cases, policy gets made by soundbite. I think reducing the condition of infrastructure to a letter grade helps to facilitate that conversation. Whether you agree or disagree with the grade, depending on which seat you're in, it starts the conversation. And I think there's value to that. The recommendations that ASCE makes in these report cards going back to 1988 have really shaped public policy. And that's the hope is, this is information that can be introduced into the public discourse and, help to in some way, move policy and to help shape direction of, policy making, funding, and other activities at those levels.
No, I mean, one thing that would be great is if there's some more granularity, because as you mentioned, there are areas like Chattanooga, Tennessee, or areas like now my island here, where you have fiber everywhere, and it's you have great smart grid modernization and public safety, and you're going to have quantum networking and all that great stuff. So there are some pockets that are have great infrastructure, and then others not so well. So it's kind of
Gary, really interesting, and I didn't speak to it before, but there is a national report card. There are also individual state report cards. So ASCE chapters in each state will also publish their own report cards on the state's infrastructure, and ASCE at a national level provides some help and assistance in reviewing those. But there are efforts, to try to take, broadband being a first-time national chapter. I don't remember the exact number. I think somewhat less than 10 maybe had included broadband chapters, but there certainly is work being done to help elevate that discourse at the state by state level as well.
Well, Ed, I really appreciate you taking time to explain the report card, and I'm very bullish. We've private equity has raised more money in the first half of this year than all of last year for broadband infrastructure. When we see all our ISP members are putting their own money in to get fiber, I feel really, really good about the investment now as we put more fiber in for AI infrastructure. I'm feeling pretty good. I mean, unfortunately, the government can't quite get it right, but private industry, when they're spending their own money, they're going to get it right. So thanks, Ed. Really appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. We look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We're going to be with our good friend, Bree Mackey, the director of the Minnesota Office of Broadband Deployment, to discuss best practicing when dealing with BEAD complexities. So be great to hear from Bree. I know that there's been some challenges on Minnesota with the whole benefit of the bargain, and we'll see what's going on with that. So please join us next week. Thanks, everyone.